Shall we start, Ines?
Perfect. Yes. Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this second session of the Pohang Network webinar series. A little bit of background before we start on where the series came from. It builds on the global exchange we held in Pohang last August, alongside the 16th Clean Energy Ministerial. And this knowledge exchange was co-organized with partners in UNIDO, but also across the steel decarbonization community. The global exchange took place during 2.5 days, and around 90 participants from more than 20 countries came together, representing governments, industry, financial institutions, NGOs, and international organizations. And the discussions were very, very rich, very interactive. They covered many aspects of the steel transition, from technologies, investment needs, policy frameworks, international collaboration. And one of the messages that emerged after the knowledge exchange was the need to bring the momentum of the conference forward and stay connected, continue exchanging experiences, and create space for more regular dialogue and broader dialogue as well. So the webinar series, the Pohang webinar series, is a direct response to that, and it aims to provide a platform where we can come together virtually on a regular basis with partners in the steel decarbonization community, share updates and compare progress and learn from each other as the transition to low-carbon steel accelerates. It's intentionally very open, not only to those that joined us in Pohang, but also to the wider network of partners and colleagues working across the steel value chain. And today's session will revisit some of the key themes from Pohang, in particular standards, MRV, and green public procurement, which are all central to building demand for low and near zero emissions steel. So with that, I will now hand it over to my colleague, Andrea Miu, who will guide us through today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Ines, for setting the stage and for welcoming us today. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us from the different time zones. It's a real pleasure to see such strong interest in today's discussions on standards, MRV, definitions for near zero steel. As Ines said, my name is Andrea Miu. I'm a coordinator with the Global Matchmaking Platform, which is hosted by UNIDO. Our platform works to connect the needs of countries in emerging and developing economies, particularly around industrial decarbonization and green industrialization, with organizations that can provide tailored technical and financial support. We bring together a broad network and a growing network of partners, including all the organizations here present in today's webinar, with the goal of ensuring that international support is coordinated, targeted, and responsive to the needs of the countries. In addition to my role, I also have the privilege of moderating today's webinar, which has emerged on the back of what we refer as the Pohang Network that Ines introduced earlier, which is a community that emerged following the in-person knowledge exchange on low-carbon steel that took place in last August in Pohang. And as Ines mentioned, today's webinar is very much a continuation of that effort, where in Pohang, a number of leading organizations came together to share insights, approaches, and lessons learned around low-carbon steel. And what we're doing today is taking that knowledge forward and opening up to a much wider audience, while also continuing to build the community of practice. Just to kind of set the context a bit of today's discussion, it is important to, of course, acknowledge that the context has evolved quite rapidly since this discussion has happened back in August. The global steel market has become more sluggish, while weaker overall demand in several regions. In some markets, the immediate concern is simply just demand for steel, even before considering the additional cost premium that may come with green steel. So that raises, of course, a valid question for today. How relevant is this discussion? And the answer is that, of course, is very relevant. It remains absolutely critical. And that's because the transition to low-emission steel is long-term structural transformation, not just a short-term market cycle. Policy frameworks, standards, and demand signals take time to design and to implement, and decisions made today will, of course, shape investment pathways for decades. So with this backdrop, today's discussion focuses on a key enabler of this transition, policy and market frameworks for green steel uptake. So broadly speaking, this includes two dimensions: standards, definitions, MRV systems. This is where significant work is already underway across governments and international initiatives. And we have speakers discussing this. And we're also talking a bit about some demand side measures, particularly around incentives and regulatory frameworks. And this is exactly why we have such an outstanding group of speakers today. We are joined by leading global initiatives and organizations, including IDDI, worldsteel, SteelZero, and ResponsibleSteel, who are really at the forefront of shaping both the technical foundations and the market signals that are needed for low-emission steel. So yeah, we truly couldn't be in better hands for these discussions, and I'm very happy to be moderating it. And before I start introducing the first speaker, I just wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. We will be having presentations from all of our speakers throughout the next few minutes. Please feel free to use the chat function. We will answer any questions live as much as possible, and then anything that remains will be taken at the end, where we have a bit of time for Q&A. But yeah, that's just to say that we'll be moving from speaker to speaker to be more efficient. Okay. With that, and to kick us off, I'm very pleased to introduce Ankita Gangotra, coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial's Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which is hosted by UNIDO. Ankita will walk us through where we currently stand on product level standards, GPP, and other things. So Ankita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Ines. I hope you all can see my slides. Can I just confirm? Great. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ankita Gangotra. I coordinate the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative based here at UNIDO headquarters in Vienna. And I'm delighted to be here amongst my esteemed fellow panelists, and very happy to kick us off giving an overview of the work that we do at IDDI, and also why it's so critical to be having this conversation right now. So IDDI is a clean energy ministerial initiative which was launched in 2021 with the mandate of creating an enabling environment for deep decarbonization of heavy industries focused on steel, cement, and concrete, using two critical levers. One is creating demand through green public procurement. The second is by harmonizing the underlying emissions accounting and benchmarking standards. So IDDI is coordinated by UNIDO and is co-led by the governments of the UK and India. Some of our latest members include the governments of Australia, Ireland, and Trinidad and Tobago. And we have a network of over 70 partners and stakeholders. All of the organizations here on the call are amongst our stakeholders. So IDDI is essentially a community of practice focused around three core technical areas. One is interoperable data and reporting. The second is harmonization of standards. And the third is green public procurement frameworks. And foundational to all of this work is promoting the interoperability and harmonization of product level emissions accounting standards and definitions for steel, cement, and concrete in service of green public procurement, but also other product level policies. So let's delve into the world of standards. We know that robust emissions accounting standards are key in allowing companies to differentiate their products on the basis of emissions and invest in critical decarbonization technologies. However, we also know that there are some key challenges around inconsistencies, gaps, and limited uptake that need to be addressed. And these concerns are becoming even more important as demand for these green products continues to grow, requiring an urgent reform in the foundation of standards. So here's a a brief overview of the landscape of iron and steel emissions accounting standards and certifications, with the caveat that this is a very non-exhaustive list. As you'll see here, standards vary in terms of granularity and emission scope, and also their intended purpose. But amongst all of this, there are some core emissions accounting topics that require harmonization. These include topics around data consistency and specificity, such as primary data requirements or treatment of secondary data sets. Also topics around emerging accounting questions, such as chain of custody methodologies, emerging green technologies such as treatment of carbon capture and utilization, and also certain topics specific to steel, such as co-product allocation and reporting emissions at a common production step. So over the years, IDDI, along with many of our partners, has developed a principle-based analysis of the role of emissions accounting standards, and we've complemented this by detailed technical guidance on reporting, addressing some issues that I just mentioned. But as a key next challenge, the question is how we go from the what to the how of standards development. Like I just mentioned, there's a good understanding of what is needed towards harmonization. IDDI, Steel Standards Principles, IEA, all of these partners have developed guidance and reports around what is needed. But the challenge is how we implement these changes required in established regional and international standards bodies. And this is in recognition that there's extensive work that has already been done to date, and consensus building can take time. However, the current revision processes can take many, many years, and standards will need to evolve and adapt at a faster rate and in parallel with each other. So as a next step, IDDI is partnering with the Industrial Transitions Accelerator in engaging international standards bodies to introduce technical guidance on harmonization and interoperability as a key principle within standard setting processes. And so since we met in Pohang, we've published a number of reports. Perhaps the most relevant to this audience is a report on considering definitions for low emissions products, including steel, cement, and concrete. I didn't have much time today to get into this, but we will be sharing these slides along with the recording, and you'll be able to access these resources through that. And finally, I'll summarize by giving a few updates from the world as a way to set the scene for the conversation ahead, and also mentioning some of the work that's upcoming within IDDI. Over the past few months since we met at Pohang, we've seen advancements under the Steel Standards Principles, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition of all of the organizations on this call today and many, many others who are working on this critical area of standards for steel decarbonization. We've also seen progress on standards harmonization through ResponsibleSteel, the European LESS standard, and the Chinese C2F standard. And then we've also seen in the past few weeks some developments through the EU Industrial Accelerator Act. Finally, in the coming months within IDDI, we're looking forward to engaging with standard setting bodies. Like I said, we've also kicked off a project on GPP criteria disclosure to encourage and support transparency in green public procurement and standards. And we're also kicking off a study on product category rules for steel, cement, and concrete, and delving into the world of these PCRs and looking for ways in which they converge and diverge. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for having me on this call, and I will hand back over to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Ankita, for your presentation, for showing us the landscape of standards and the work that you're doing at IDDI. let's move on to our next speaker, who is Claire Broadbent, Head of Sustainability at worldsteel. Claire leads the work on sustainability and methodology accounting across steel value chains and plays a key role in international efforts to harmonize standards methodologies, including the steel standards principles. So Claire, let's get over to you for your presentation.
Great, thanks. And hello, everyone. Nice to be here today. So yes, I'm Claire Broadbent, Head of Sustainability for worldsteel. For those of you who are not so familiar with who we are, we're the global association of steel producers from all around the world. So we represent in total over 85% of global crude steel production, which is around between 1.7 and 1.8 billion tons of steel being made every year. So our other members are also the national and regional steel associations and other bodies who are working on the interests of the steel industry. So I'm really here today to talk about the work that we've been doing. And if we just go on to the next slide, we, as worldsteel, we've been working on this topic of methodologies and standards now for more than 3 decades. So we started back in the 1990s, and it was really to see when we were comparing or being compared by other materials who were claiming to have a better environmental performance, we didn't have an answer. So we needed to start the work on LCA to understand where we were and how we performed compared to these other materials. And that's obviously advanced since that time. So we have 2 different ways that we're accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. One is which is embedded in the LCA data, and the other, which we began in 2008, which focused at that time on CO2 emissions from a site level reporting. So this was to sort of see a one steel company, how they could evolve over time. However, as we all know, and the reason why we're here, that we see this whole proliferation of standards which continues. Steel is used in a wide variety of sectors, so pretty much every sector and in all geographies. So when we hear discussions from the cement and concrete sector who are in construction and infrastructure, sometimes it's with a bit of jealousy that they have one main sector to focus on, and therefore a much reduced number of standards that are out there. However, this is a challenge we have to face, and also because there's an evolving requirement for the standards. So whether it's a product level, or you're looking at your site, you're looking at your company emissions, or maybe it's on policy and now on trade, things like CBAM, we have the IAA, there are the finance community, they also want to have their way of calculating things. Customers have different requirements from different sectors. We need to make sure that we're aligned not only within the steel sector, but also the methodologies for other materials. We have different definitions for what is low carbon steel. All of these different things means that this demands really agreed measurement methodologies so that we can actually make sure that what is being measured and reported on today can be consistent as much as possible between these different standards that are out there. So if we go on to the next slide, this just summarizes some of the activities that we're trying to sort of focus on in terms of the alignment and interoperability. So I've mentioned the 2 systems we have within worldsteel, and yes, we were causing part of the problem because these approaches were also not aligned. But we've done work to improve that. The site-based one, which was originally CO2-based, is moving towards greenhouse gas-based reporting. It's increasing in its boundaries. And basically, this is also aligned with the work which is being done within the ISO perspective on steel-related standards. And it's a very good example of where collaboration has worked very well. We developed our methodology as worldsteel. It then became an ISO standard. ResponsibleSteel needed a standard, so they took what worldsteel had done, improved on it, and we're now incorporating those improvements in the work that we're doing at worldsteel, and that will also be done in ISO. So it's a very good example of how this collaboration can work together. We know also the ISO and Greenhouse Gas Protocol partnership, which is also their way of trying to focus on alignment of the standards. A new approach which was launched last year, the Carbon Measures Coalition. This is again saying, yes, they feel that there's a need for additional ways to report, and this is based on ledger-based reporting. And this is now very much underway, and we're sort of following and tracking that one. There's a lot of international cross-sector work programs and coalitions being developed. So while we've seen the proliferation of standards, we're also seeing the proliferation of harmonization reports or harmonization attempts. So it's key that we're sort of involved there. There's also an increasing focus also on green iron standards and methodologies, and we need to make it clear that the methodologies we have in place for steel cover iron. So please don't go and create anything new just for iron, because that can be already included. These chain of custody accounting methodologies, mass balance and book and claim, those are proliferating at an even faster rate, and all the work that's being done there in many different sectors. And then finally, leads into the work of the Steel Standards Principles, which is focusing really on the alignment of standards related to the steel sector. So if we go on to the next slide, the benefit of the Steel Standards Principles for World Steel is it's not just the steel sector, the steel companies or the steel associations who are involved. It's very much multi sector involvement. We can see the endorsers of these Steel Standards Principles on the next slide. And it's really, a great way to have this collaboration through a whole ecosystem of different organizations. But what we need to remember is that while we have this focusing on steel, we need to make sure that all of these different approaches are compatible with other materials, and we're not seeing that there's the misalignment. And so I think that's great why the work that Ankita was talking about for IDDI does bring that aspect in, at least for the construction side. So the Steel Standards Principles were launched in 2023. On the next slide, this shows a few more examples than Ankita put up there about these are some of the real key initiatives that we need to follow. There are many more out there. We've done a mapping exercise of at least 50 of these different methodologies and approaches. And if you go on the next slide, we launched at the end of last year a website for the Steel Standards Principles. So all the work that's coming out of here is available in one place very easily. And if you just click a couple of times, so we have the information there. One of the things that we worked on as the initiative was creating a glossary of terms so that we're using consistent terminology when we're trying to work on consistency within methodologies. And so it's all, you can easily access that via the SSP website. It's linked very much to different aspects of alignment, whether it's related to methodologies or system boundaries and things. We know that it's not necessarily a perfect set of definitions, but we needed to get something published. It had a lot of consultation, so we welcome any feedback. So that's all there. The latest thing that we published at the end of last year, if we click again, are the transparency in greenhouse gas emissions metrics for steel. And this was really as a way to say, we know that we haven't got alignment in methodologies. However, we also know that there are different reasons why the methodologies exist. And so we're not really looking for one single methodology, but what we are looking for is to have some consistency, some alignment there. And if we're looking at this slide here, it's really talking about what are the additional parts of information that should be reported together with the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas emissions number from the steel company to enable some comparability between the different systems and for people to understand. So we've listed the different things here. It's about making sure that you're reporting on the methodology you've used, the amount of scrap that's being included in there, and also a key point on data quality. The organisations shown at the bottom are the ones which have already agreed to incorporate this in their reporting requirements. On the next slide, then, we see some more qualitative information that we're asking to be reported. Have you used primary or secondary data for your emission factors? Are you using hydrogen or bio-based fuels? Have you used market-based or location-based electricity mixes or carbon capture and storage? And it's really just to give this overall idea of what's being included there. On the next slide, we see this more in a visual way to show, okay, this is the minimum reporting boundary, which you can see going up to the crude steel level. You can have extended boundaries to include the hot rolling because that's required by certain systems. The second one is on an extended boundary, which obviously means that you can do your full product LCA. The different areas which are highlighted in with the white boxes are those areas where we're asking for that additional information to be reported. And the aim of this is going to be interactive, so you can either choose one specific methodology and see what those methodology requirements are without reading their 150-page methodology report, or you can do some comparison. So just to finish on the final slide. Oh, yeah, thanks. The next steps that we have in terms of alignment is really to try to get an increase in the uptake of this additional reporting requirements, which will help external stakeholders understand what the differences are, why would there need to be differences. And this also involves a call for access to generic upstream data sets so we can improve in the consistency of that information that's there. So we will further develop the transparency reporting criteria I've just shown, piloting their use with different companies and initiatives in the coming months. I'll leave the interoperability guidance to Annie, who I'm sure will be talking about that, but that hopefully feeds into the SSP work. And then to facilitate dialogue among the different stakeholders to promote wider understanding and support for harmonised approaches, and really to try and take this forward without the creation of yet more standards or more harmonisation guidance and initiatives. So with that, I'll finish and hand back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Claire, for showing us the great work that you do at WorldSteel, including starting from LCAs, which you've been doing for such a long time, and now you're moving that more into alignment, interoperability, transparency, and of course how all this needs to be grounded in collaborations to fully work. I think that's a very strong message there from you. Let's move on to our next speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Samin Khan, who is the Senior Manager for Steel at Climate Group, who is leading the SteelZero initiative. Samin will share some insights on the practical applications of MRV systems, including how procurement commitments are being translated into action. So, Samin, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and it's lovely to be here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this webinar. So I've already been introduced. I won't repeat all of that. But I think what we've heard so far has been a very kind of like really good example of kind of alignment and harmonization between our organizations as well. And then also obviously in the wider landscape of steel decarbonization, we are kind of working towards that alignment between standards, definitions, kind of what's happening on the supply side with the accounting methodologies coming together, or the data transparency coming together, and how it's actually really important for us to communicate that to downstream customers, which is kind of the role that SteelZero plays, is kind of we're bringing that information to the buyers of steel so they are better informed as well and are able to make those procurement decisions for lower emission steel and then eventually near zero emission steel when that is ready. So if you could go to the next slide, I will do a quick introduction about SteelZero, because we are a global demand initiative led by Climate Group and in partnership with ResponsibleSteel. And our purpose is to catalyze global demand to support the industry to transition towards net zero steel production. And what this means is that we want to create a market that enables the supply chain to shift towards net zero and also critically have lower emission steel brought to market like imminently, like by 2030. And how we do this is with the leading demand side businesses that have kind of taken those first steps to make a public commitment to start procuring and sending those signals to their supply chain upstream that they would want access to lower emission steel products. And that demand signal is what we kind of work together and kind of collectively bring together so it can show the evidence to the market that there is a need for these products and that the supply chains can shift. The policy advocacy, we do policy advocacy as well to kind of bring about more kind of supportive regulations across global markets as well to enable the steel production to decarbonize. So that's the kind of, in a nutshell, the role of SteelZero. So if you move to the next slide, I've just got a list here. I won't go through it, but this is our current membership, and it spans across all sectors and geographies, and also like all parts of the supply chain. So it's not just end consumers, but also manufacturers and stockists in the supply chain. Next slide, please. And when we talk about kind of harmonization, what the SteelZero members commit to is procuring at least 50% of their steel requirement by 2030 under that lower emission steel threshold, which is what we have aligned with ResponsibleSteel's decarbonization progress level 2 on. So it is sending, I guess, a clear signal on what emissions profile of steel is required by customers. And we took the step to, of course, align with ResponsibleSteel, because that's another thing that we are talking about, is kind of aligning and harmonizing and not having a proliferation of definitions of procurement requirements. And it is, excellent that it's not just like SteelZero and ResponsibleSteel that use the scrap variable steel decarbonization scale, but it is also used by a majority of other standards and initiatives like First Movers Coalition and RMI in their Sustainable Steel Buyers platform. So it's a lot of these demand initiatives, as well as some of the standards that use the scrap variable scale. And of course, Annie will speak more about the interoperability between the standards on that front. So this is how we're kind of coming together in the landscape. So that's intro on the SteelZero side. If we move to the next slide about measurement, reporting, and verification. So what we've actually done together as a group of demand side companies is we came together a few years ago to start putting together like what is the reporting requirements for the customers, like what are the data that they want to access through their supply chain. And the primary purpose of us doing this exercise was to come up with a consistent, clear, and coordinated way to ask the supply chain for data. And this is obviously extremely important for customers, because they want the confidence about if they do put out a procurement policy for lower emission products, what kind of data and results are they going to get from their supply chain? And the first steps for us was to just understand whether customers got access to this data or not. So we developed a reporting framework with our members. We tested it a few years ago, and now we've run 2 rounds of reporting on that. And we've developed tools and guidance, such as like questionnaires on how to ask for that data or how to communicate with their supply chain on why this data is needed and why it's important to them. And so this is all kind of really prompted a lot of conversations all the way upstream towards this, in the supply chain, all the way to steel makers. Just a point to note here is that so far we've done a lot of the measurement and the reporting side of it, but we have not yet tapped into verification, because I guess that's one of the challenges, is there's such a variation in the kind of data that flows through the supply chain and that customers get access to. So it's not been easy for us to make any comparisons or verify so that the customers could make claims on how much they progressed in procuring those products. So if we could go to the next slide, I just want to show a quick snapshot of what we have seen through our 2 years of reporting. And what we want to show through this is that as the customers are asking for more information from their suppliers, they are getting access to it. So there has been an improvement in the tons of steel that they have been purchasing for which data is available, that they've been able to report to us. And that improvement year on year shows that it could hopefully keep on improving. And there are still gaps in the data that members can get access to. Like a lot of the steel product information they get comes without the scrap share, for example, or some even without the emissions data. Those gaps do still exist, but they have narrowed since the previous year. If we go to the next slide. So in summary, I think what we have found through the work that we've done with the demand side is that, of course, those challenges in accessing data will continue to persist because there is a very complex multi-layered supply chain that we're working with, and the customers are placed in different parts of the supply chain as well. We know that there's variations in data sources that they get access to, and we haven't yet been able to make any verifications and claims on that just yet. But from what we've heard from the presenters so far and what we'll hear from ResponsibleSteel as well, all the kind of efforts that's going towards alignment and interoperability between standards are kind of what's absolutely crucial and necessary for us to be able to move towards that better comparison and verification. And then there's going to be more kind of confidence on the demand side to make those commitments, to procure lower emission products, and to be able to report or measure the progress that they're making on that front as well. And that's all from me for now. Thank you very much, and hand back to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Samin, for showing us the buyer's perspective and the work that you're doing at SteelZero. It's advanced a lot since last time we've been in touch a couple of years ago, so it's very fantastic to see. Now, finally, but of course not least, we have Annie Heaton. Annie, she is the CEO of ResponsibleSteel. We've heard a lot about ResponsibleSteel from our different speakers and how you plugged in different things, but you are here to talk to us about alignment, interoperability, harmonization. So Annie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. Look, I'm going to focus particularly on interoperability in practice, but much has already been said, I think, on why we need interoperability. In a nutshell, when you see two carbon intensity data points from different producers, ostensibly reporting the same thing, they're actually likely to be inconsistent, incomparable, and probably under scrutinized as well. But if you apply this to what we are actually looking to drive here, which is low emission steel production. Now, steelmakers want to create market value from their decarbonisation investments, but if the market isn't clear what it's valuing, then buyers and also investors will find it very hard to put a price on it. So we know without clarity, consistency, coherence, and also credibility, that we are not going to see an effective market for low emission steel. And I think it's in large part the reasons why we've seen such sluggishness, and that's even before the current economic and political challenges we're facing. So in all markets, buyers need to have confidence in the claims that are made, and that confidence needs to also rest on the data that underpins those claims. So that requires common rules and common systems of trust. But when we have today's reality of multiple divergent standards and systems, interoperability provides a practical solution. So where methodologies are sufficiently aligned, then interoperability can enable conversion from one standard to another and vice versa. So it can allow ultimately different standards to speak the same language. And that enables steel producers to compare their emissions performance across multiple standard systems, whilst also, we hope, reducing their reporting burden. So it can enable also coherence between different policy instruments across jurisdictions, and it can provide a solid reference point for trade agreements. And importantly, it enables increased market scale so that procurement systems, whether private or public, can ultimately access more low-emission steel and make the case for investment to be more realistic. So this has been our conviction at ResponsibleSteel, and it's been the rationale for our decision 3 years ago, in fact, to develop our interoperability program on GHG. And since then, we've worked with numerous initiatives, including RMI, the Climate Bonds Initiative, the Sustainable Steel Principles, which were developed by 6 banks few years ago, and then with IDDI, the World Steel Association, to co-found the Steel Standards Principles, which I think are a couple of years ago, but have really taken on a lot of the momentum around this, which is fantastic. And we've also worked with the Steel Standards Principles to encourage credibility in interoperability. And we've sought to demonstrate this in practice, and that's what I'm going to share with you. So if we can go to the next slide. Before we Before we move on, for those of you who are not familiar with ResponsibleSteel, we are a multi-stakeholder standards and certification organisation, and our mission is to drive the decarbonisation of steel globally in a way that is both socially and environmentally responsible. We're global in coverage and also in our membership and our mission. So to date, as you can see, we have 90 sites that are come under our core ESG certification with 140 million tonnes of production. And that's around 7 to 8% of global output. And we have 2.5 million tonnes of production that actually also enjoy steel certification. And that denotes progress in both decarbonisation and responsible sourcing over and above our core ESG certification. Next slide, please. So coming back to interoperability, in November last year at COP30, we were able to announce 2 agreements on interoperability in practice. And they're taking this concept really to the next level so that it can actually benefit markets and trade. So one agreement was with the Chinese Iron and Steel Association and the other with the Brussels-based low-emission steel standard. Now, each one of these agreements, these projects, will be working through the practicalities of how to enable interoperability to work so that 1 tonne of steel that's produced in one of these countries can be certified under one scheme in that country, but may also make a claim that is understood and seen to be credible in a different market, in a different country. So let's try and put this into context of a buyer. What might this mean? Given Samin's just done her SteelZero presentation, let's take the example of a SteelZero member that's committed to procuring 50% of their steel to reach our decarbonisation progress level 2 by 2030. Now, there may be steel producers in the world who are certified to a different scheme. It might be the LESS scheme or it might be the C2F scheme. So our interoperability mechanisms will enable suppliers that are producing low-emission steel verified on the market to one of those schemes to be used to match a SteelZero member company's commitments. So whether they're certified by LESS, C2F or ResponsibleSteel. And that means as a buyer that the buyer can strengthen their demand signal by specifying requirements for low-emission steels in terms of certifications that can be seen as equivalent to ResponsibleSteel. So, for example, that we require steel that has achieved carbon intensity performance equivalent to ResponsibleSteel decarbonisation progress level 2. So you can see how that enables scaling of the market. And I think it's also worth saying that this approach, if it's considered by the policymaker, also holds the potential to ensure that policy can be designed in such a way that steels certified to one scheme can be traded across borders and meet the needs of another scheme that is recognised in a policy elsewhere. Next slide, please. So I'm just giving you a brief glimpse of what our credible interoperability mechanism involves from a ResponsibleSteel perspective. And it's not just about computing emissions under different schemes, but also it's about driving clarity and confidence. So last November, along with our MOUs, we also published this framework for credible interoperability. And it's designed to ensure a robust and consistent approach to these mechanisms that convert carbon metrics across standards and ensure that they're designed with technical quality and also with oversight. So we had a lot of input from endorsers of the Steel Standards Principles over the last year, and we hope this framework will serve more broadly for the SSB community. It starts with alignment of accounting rules to maximise a comparability. So all the things that Claire has talked about. And in fact, we've worked with both of these 2 schemes, LESS and C2F, over really more than a year to work on that alignment. It also involves the calculation tool. That's perhaps the most obvious piece. And then it involves focusing on ensuring that verification and assurance is consistent and trustworthy. And this is actually proving to be a really, really key part of our interoperability programs that we're working with, and we'll be holding workshops in these different parts of the world in the months to come. It involves ensuring that the interoperability claims are credible, whether it's an equivalency claim or a direct claim. Importantly, all of this rests on mutual agreement between the different systems and their organizations. And that's really essential for the smooth development and implementation and ultimately maintenance of an interoperability mechanism between different standards, and the key aspects of governance that requires, which you can see here. So all of this really provides a roadmap for the work that we're doing with our partners now to enable us to make interoperability work in practice. So finally, we can go to the last slide, please. Coming back to this idea of a bridge that we're building between different systems. To summarize, what we're seeking to do is demonstrate in practice how interoperability mechanisms can really show equivalency between different standards or policy mechanisms, and through credible claims, and really expand the pool of steel that is eligible for low-emission steel tenders, removing the inherent restrictions on competition that multiple systems can create. It's aimed to enable robust claims of equivalency between different standards or classification systems, and ultimately support trade in low-emission steel between countries. So trade in the steel industry will always be with us, and so it's particularly valuable to see the interest that we've received in interoperability, not only between standards but also between trading nations. And what I ultimately like to see, I think, in the months and years to come, is agreements between governments now to develop interoperability between their respective systems. And of course, we're happy to support that. But I want to end with one final point, which is that interoperability, what I've described here, is a fix to a very imperfect world. I think it's really incumbent on all those involved in standards and policy development to avoid the need for interoperability in the first place. We don't want to build a system, a labyrinth of interoperability mechanisms. We want to create alignment and recognition of existing standards rather than create a whole new industry. So I'll leave it there with that, on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie, for showing us your presentation, and of course for showing us what's needed to enable interoperability and the roadmap of how you're taking this into practice. Thank you also to all our speakers up until now for your very insightful contributions. We are now moving into the discussion segment of our webinar. We have roughly 10 minutes left here. So I would like to encourage participants to share their questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible. And while we wait for your questions to come in, let me start with a few to just kick off the discussion. So Claire, maybe perhaps we can start with you. You highlighted in your presentation that there is a growing complexity and proliferation of methodologies. So I was wondering, from an emissions accounting perspective, like which are the elements, like system boundaries or data quality or scrap, for example, like which of these elements are the most difficult to align in your perspective across standards?
Well, we have one of the most awful topics which has been debated for 30 years, which is all about the co-product allocation, because this is it's a difficult topic within the steel sector. This is how you account for the different byproducts and co-products that the steel industry makes and sells beyond steel. So the slags, which are used by the cement and concrete sector to reduce, and this to make sure that not only are we aligned and interoperable within the steel sector, but also with other sectors. So making sure that we're not losing out on emissions because we're reporting it in one way and other industries are reporting it in another way. The existing standards are quite contradictory in terms of what is allowed and is not allowed for this topic. So yeah, this is quite something which the industry has been tackling with for quite some time. And then some of the other parts are more in terms of the sensitivities that the steel companies have in terms of what data they feel that they want to be reporting, and whether they make that publicly available on a wide scale or directly to the customers, just because of commercial sensitivity and things. And I think when we're seeing the proliferation of the chain of custody type of standards, where you've got, let's say in the plastic sector, a lot of calculations to look at the recycled content based on mass balance, and then you're comparing those with the absolute recycled content of steel. Again, it sort of adds into the complexity of trying to compare one material with another, because the methodologies that have been used are not consistent.
Thank you so much for that, Claire. That's very interesting. And I'm wondering that if we can build a bit on the steel standards principles, also kind of like following on the thought of what you mentioned, what would be like some kind of like minimum data points, common data points that you believe it's essential for this comparability across markets?
So this is what I showed on the transparency criteria form that we've not, the criteria that we've developed, and the infographic to highlight these different things. So really at the basic level, the reporting at a crude steel level, trying to report at least on the scrap input, but again, we need to have a common definition of how you calculate that scrap input value, and data quality. And then the other aspects are making sure that you're at least being transparent in terms of what you're reporting on and what your system boundaries is that you've included. But at least if everybody's reporting at the crude steel level, that's the sort of lowest common denominator if you're trying to do the comparison between different products. But you provide that number in addition to what your product carbon footprint is, or your site level, or your organizational level.
Thank you, Claire. And building on that, but moving towards to Samin, basically from a buyer's perspective, what you showed in your presentation is that there is still a significant share of data that is missing in steel procurement. And I was wondering, like, what do you see will be like the main practical barriers that companies, the buyers that you work with, that they're facing today in inaccessible, this reliable data across their supply chains?
Yes, sure. I think the main challenge is, I mean, for us, our membership, like I said, spans kind of all parts of the downstream supply chain. So where we've got fabricators or manufacturers that are closer to the steel makers, they are able to get access to data perhaps more easily. But where you go down 3-4 times down towards the end users, it becomes challenging. So the complexity of the supply chain is a big barrier to how much data that our members or buyers can actually get access to. And then the other point is how that data is being shared, right? Like historically, or like so far, the most common way is through EPDs. And EPDs also follow very different methodologies and standards. And so the data points that are provided through EPDs are extremely different. And it gets challenging for the customers to make any comparisons in that sense. And then also, it's the state of the product, I guess, the production. It's not just like it's how far the steel product has been like manufactured, or in what state it has been provided to the customer. So again, you have all the added emissions from the manufacturing and to the final products. So that again makes comparisons a bit challenging, because you're getting all different types of steel products that the customers are buying. So there are all of these different reasons, which is why it's great that through the SSP, there's this work on the transparency criteria and making at least that crude steel data available through all the different standards, because that would be extremely helpful and a good starting point for the customers as well.
Yeah, thank you, Samin, for that. That's very interesting, and I want to kind of like build a bit on that, because in your presentation you were also mentioning that the V part of MRV, the verification element, is not yet fully established, or you've not yet explored it. So I was wondering if this uncertainty that you've also mentioned also in your answer now, like how it affects the decisions of the companies that you're working with. Like, are they still able to act, or does it just completely slow down their ability to act on this?
No, I think it's all getting started, right? We are right now still in that exercise of trying to get access to data for our members, for the buyers. They want to first set up the processes, communicate with their supply chain to actually start getting access to the data. And I think once we've got a good handle on what buyers can get access to, then we could look at the verification side of things. But also the verification is not easy. It's especially for the SteelZero commitment, because like I said, we are aligned with ResponsibleSteel on using the ResponsibleSteel methodology that's up to crude steel scope, and a lot of the data that the customers do get access to is through EPDs, which is at a product level sometimes. So there's that difference as well in what the SteelZero commitment is asking for and what the buyers are getting hold of. So, which is again a point that we need to clarify before we even step towards verification. But at the same time, I think just understanding what's available within the supply chain and what the challenges are in accessing the data, that's been very insightful for us. And that's where we can kind of start working with the supply chain, the stakeholders necessary to start closing down those barriers.
Thank you so much, Samin. Maybe we can move now to Ankita, and more from like a policy side, more from a government perspective, kind of like building on the conversation that we've had here. We've seen what Samin is seeing, but like from the government's side, how do you see that governments can design procurement frameworks that can to kind of balance this ambition with like what we're seeing in terms of market realities, in terms of availability, data availability, and things like that?
Yeah, good question, Andrea. And what we're seeing is that governments are moving forward with green public procurement, regardless of the status of the standards themselves, right? So governments recognizing that green public procurement perhaps is one of the key levers for industrial decarbonization, and that governments have such a big role, are often the single largest buyers for these products, are moving ahead with the standards that they have available to them within the broader policy context of their countries, and designing for these green public procurement policies and setting criteria for themselves. So it behooves us, and like I said in my presentation, it behooves us to keep up and to ensure that there's that interoperability and that harmonization, such that there's not that added burden then on the private sector itself. But the demand is increasing, and governments are increasingly wanting further guidance in this area, increasingly wanting to know what the status of the standards are, but of course are basing all of this within their own domestic policy contexts as well.
Thank you so much, Ankita. And then maybe, Annie, we can move on to you to bring this all together from a standards and certification perspective. In your presentation, you emphasized that interoperability, it's a mouthful, is a way to translate across the systems, right? So we're wondering from how can certification schemes bridge these differences between the different standards without creating additional complexity?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, the first thing is alignment. And I saw there's a question in the chat about RMI, and actually one of the first bits of work we did on interoperability was alignment with the sustainable steel principles, which RMI developed for the banking sector. So creating as much alignment as possible, and where every standard should go through a revision every 5 years to be a credible standard that keeps up with it, stakeholders' needs, and irons out imperfections in the standards and make sure it's fit for purpose. And so all standards have the opportunity to create more alignment. Now, really key when standards are doing that is to look at those transparency principles that Claire outlined, that the steel standards principles have come up with, because that is the key. If everyone can align as far as possible, at least on transparency, that then gets you further towards interoperability. It doesn't get you necessarily to a harmonized standard, but it gets you to clarity. And if you've got clarity, then you can build a calculation tool and you can create equivalence between standards. So that's really it. But I think the final thing to say is simply that as new policies emerge and new ideas are created, new initiatives to really try and catapult low emission steel production, there are standards for every purpose already out there. Claire's outlined them, whether they're site, product or company level standards. And I think to look at what's going on in the world of interoperability, whether it's the GHG protocol and ISO or ResponsibleSteel and the partners that we're working with, the direction of travel is alignment and working together rather than creating new systems. And we just need to get that message across to everyone who's thinking of creating a new standard tomorrow.
Thank you, and it's a great thought to end on. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I know there's still quite a few questions in the chat function that perhaps remain unanswered, but perhaps we can take those separately. I can see like some of our panelists are already answering those, which is great. But like as we come to the end of today's session, maybe just let me briefly summarize what we've heard. First, we started with the idea that market conditions may fluctuate, but the transitions to low-emission steel remains a long-term priority, of course, and one that requires a sustained coordinations across industry, across governments, international initiatives, across the great organizations here. Second, we heard that standards, MRV systems, definitions, they're not just technical tools, they are really foundational to build trust and comparability and to ultimately build that demand for low emission steel. And third, that the fact that demand side measures have a critical role to play in creating market signals that are needed to scale low emission steel. So I'd like to thank everyone again for this great conversations. From the perspective of the global matchmaking platform where I work, this is exactly where we aim to contribute. We bring together countries, technical experts, financial institutions, and implementing partners to work together on translating global knowledge into country-specific support, to facilitate connections and partnerships, and of course to ensure that solutions are aligned with national priorities and realities. And we also see this, of course, in the Pohang network and the discussions like today is as a key mechanism to continue sharing knowledge, to foster alignment, and to build strong global community of practice in this space. So with that, I'd like again to thank our excellent speakers, our organizers at UNIDO, and of course, all of you for joining and contributing to the discussion. And yeah, we look forward to continuing this exchange. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you, Andrea. Maybe before we close, just a brief final point. As the webinar series evolves, we are exploring about how it could develop beyond a set of webinars into a more structured community of practice, bringing together policymakers, practitioners, financiers, and industry leaders working on low-carbon steel. The aim would be to create a space, an online space for continuous exchange where we can stay connected, share progress, resources, and organize more convenings. Before deciding to take this forward from UNIDO, we would really value your input in shaping this to ensure that any next steps for creating a formalized community of practice reflect the needs and priorities of the existing steel decarbonization community, and that we can build this in a way that is useful and relevant for all the professionals in this space. So I will share a link for a short survey in the chat, and we would greatly appreciate your input to that, as it will be quite decisive to how or if we shape this community. Thank you again so much for your participation today, and we really look forward to the next webinar and staying in touch. And thank you for the great speakers as well for all the insightful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.